Hello and welcome to the Product Opscast with Graham Reed and Antonia Landy. Welcome, Antonia. How are you doing today?
I'm very well. Thank you, Graham.
Fabulous. Today we are joined by Michael, no, Martin Eriksson, well-loved product expert, co-founder of Mind the Product back in the day, author, exec. Do you know what? I feel there's no intro needed to you, Martin. You've done so much over the years for our profession, our wider profession. Your name is so well known. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Do you want to just, for those that maybe don't know you or your history, do you want to give us a quick, brief intro to yourself and what you've done over the years?
Yeah, so I'm Swedish originally, despite my accent. I grew up very internationally. I built my first website in 1994. I ran what I think is the first live stream in Europe in 1995. And I've kind of been chasing that ever since, of just building stuff online. I got my first product job in 1999. I haven't looked back really. So done product manager to senior product manager to kind of VP 4 times in a row. As you said, I founded Product Tank, co-founded Mind the Products. I authored a book on product leadership, mainly as an excuse to go interview 150 product leaders. And then the last sort of 6-7 years, I've been a product partner at EQT, which is one of the world's largest private investors, helping over 150 portfolio companies with product strategy, scaling, org design, all those fun things. And just now finished my second book, The Decision Stack, trying to bring all that together into one place.
Fabulous. Well, that leads us nicely into the topic for today. And once again, well, thank you for taking the time out of your very busy book launch and book promo schedule to come and talk to us a little bit today. The book, the Decision Stack, I was very honoured to kind of read it, have a preview of it. Just I think one of the things that I found most interesting about it was it's so obvious. And I don't mean that in any derogatory way at all, but reading through it and I'm thinking, I've done kind of a lot of this and this should be, why are we not all doing this? Why is this not so very natural to us when we've gone through, building up, and how we make our decisions, how that strategy all falls together throughout the various different layers. And yet you've written it all down and it's just so well written and well concise. And I think for anybody coming through the product management career cycle, would be absolutely fantastic to read this and to get you started.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's almost the first reaction I get from a lot of people, right, is that kind of almost facepalm moment, right? Because it just seems so obvious, and yet we're just not doing it very well in our organizations either. So I think it's like a lot of those first principles, right? It's the same reaction. I think Marty Kagan gets in a lot of his books. I think it's the same reaction. If you've been doing discovery for a really long time, you probably have the same reaction when you read Teresa Torres's books. And you're just reminded that, like, oh, right, there are these fundamental things that I should be doing I'm not doing, even though you know them. And so hopefully it's just a lens, even for more experienced product people or founders and execs as well, to look back at like, oh, right, I do have to connect these things. And this is what good strategy looks like. This is what good principles look like. And then how to bring them to life for my team, right? Because I think it's one thing knowing these things and another thing actually enacting them in our organizations, right?
But I think with that as well is it can be so easy to go down a bit of a rabbit hole of how you're thinking, how you're strategizing, how you're putting your plans together, or you end up kind of trying something out and you end up being so far down a pathway that you find it difficult to kind of get back to those first principles again. Why are we doing this? What is the value that we're trying to deliver here? Antonio talks so much about this on our show and elsewhere about kind of like, actually, look, what are we trying to solve? What's the problem that we're really trying to solve here? And so that's, again, a reason why I think, having read the book, it's a really timely reminder to say, hey, look, do you know what? You can keep this simple. You don't need to make your strategy layers so super complicated just for either the sake of it or because actually you get so wrapped up in what you're thinking, what you're doing.
Yeah. Maybe before we get into the conversation a little further, now I know the decision stack has been around for a while, marinating. I think a lot of people have already used it quite successfully in their companies and teams. But for those of us who maybe are hearing about it for the very first time today, can you give us a really brief intro about those first principles and what you take them through in the book?
Yeah, so there's a couple of things, right? I think The most simple version of this is that it's really 5 fundamental questions I think every organization or every product team has to answer, right? Number 1 is, where are we going? Second one is, how are we going to get there? Third one's, what's important right now and how do we measure progress on that journey? Fourth one is, what actions are we going to take to actually start moving forward? And the fifth one is, how do we choose between those actions? Sounds really simple, but as you go through organizations, it proves really tough to answer those questions sometimes. And so I use vision, strategy, objectives, and key results, opportunities, and principles to answer those questions. But one of the reasons I lead with the questions is I'm very agnostic to how you answer them, right? I know not everybody loves OKRs, and that's fine, but you do have to have an answer to that question, right? You have to be able to answer to your organization what's important right now and how you're measuring progress. Whether you're using KPIs, NCTs, vMost, whatever tool set you want to use to do that, that's fine, as long as you can answer the question. And I think these are important as well because they stack, right? It's not necessarily a cascade. There's kind of a semantic difference there maybe, but the idea is, as you go from the top to bottom, you're answering the question how, right? So you're looking at your vision, you're saying, okay, how are we going to achieve that? Well, here's our strategy, and so on. But most importantly for me, because I'm a massive believer in empowered teams, is as individual contributors, when you're looking at a piece of work, you can ask the question why and connect it all the way up, right? So why am I doing this piece of work? Well, because we're trying to hit these objectives. Why are we doing that? Because that gets us towards a strategy, and so on. And so it's really those connecting pieces, I think, that are the big unlock in the decision stack. And I think that's where, to Graham's point, like that's where you can use it as a diagnostic and not, overcomplicate it. Like you might have a 1-sentence answer to the question. As long as that connects, that's fine. That's maybe all you need, right? And so really that's where that simple mental model concept comes from, of treating this more as a lens to look at your organization and the decisions you've already made, than necessarily thinking like, oh, here's a new framework that we have to go through and fill in from the scratch and check all the boxes and do the decision stack right? That's kind of not what I wanted it to be.
Yeah, and I love that you're focusing on questions here, but I think that's also what makes it sound deceptively simple, right? Because
Yes.
on the face of it, the questions are like, there's not a lot of jargon in them, it's very plain language. We all understand the questions, but the difficulty arises from trying to answer one of the questions. And that's where your product leaders go, wait a minute, there's not actually a straightforward way for me to answer that. And I wonder if you've noticed that as well, but every so often I feel like when a product leader starts rambling a little bit, that's when right, a little bit. You need to dig a little bit deeper or maybe refine that language a little bit more, because I think at the end of the day, strategy only lives if people know it and understand it, right? And I
100%.
think that's the really big one.
And I think what you find as well, or what I find, is when I go into organizations, it's not just about product either, but it's, you start asking leaders across the organization these questions, and they might think they're simple, but you very quickly get very different answers back, right?
Right.
And that's not a great sign either, because then your organization's starting to pull in different directions. And I think that's also why it's so timely right now, this model and this book, because with AI, we're just moving ever faster, as you guys know. And as soon as we start unleashing agents in our organizations, we're going to be moving at the speed of machines. And if they're all headed in different directions or the wrong direction, or don't have that coherence or don't have that clarity, that's going to be even worse, right, than doing it at human speed. So that clarity, that coherence, that connection, I think that's the real unlock in the decision stack.
And that's an interesting piece there, because who is this book for? Oh, sorry, and not just the book, but who is the decision stack for? And the reason I ask that is, if you've got lots of people moving in lots of different directions, who is the best person to kind of go, hey, look, we need to get a hold of this. We need to be much more aligned. Let's use let's diagnose this using the decision stack, and let's get everybody back aligned. But who's the person to be doing that, using this?
I think on the face of it is definitely leadership's job, right? I think this is what the big missing piece is in empowered teams for me. When we wrote product leadership back in 2017, again, it was really just an excuse to go learn from a bunch of product leaders. But the outcome of that was really, the best teams are empowered teams, right? They're the ones closest to the customer, they're closest to the data, they're closest to the technology. So we need to empower them. But empowering them without this clarity is kind of abandonment, right? So we have to provide the strategic context for them to be able to operate. And so that's really leadership's job. And I think it's actually empowering for leaders to say, this is what you should be focused on. getting into the weeds of roadmaps or details or features or, things like that, but setting up this context, right? Focusing more on strategy, focusing on putting good objectives in place. But then obviously it's also a team effort, right? And I write about this in the book that I hope that this is also empowering for even individual contributors, but also team leads to be able to question some of this stuff upwards, right? Like, I need this clarity. This isn't clear to me. Can you help clarify what our strategy is? Why are we focused on this? What, I've learned something new in the discovery that we've been doing that, questions one of those assumptions. Can we change that? So, as a product person, it kind of makes me itch a little to say that it's for everyone in the organization because, being everything for everyone isn't that good. But I genuinely believe it is both for leaders and kind of ICs to be able to use this from different ends, right? But to force that clarity in our organizations.
I love that two-way street. And I think that's something that folks tend to forget. There are, I think, militants on either side, right? I think there's folks that feel like strategy and direction has to come from the top and only come from the top. And I think there are some folks who are very frustrated to feel like bottom up is the only real way to go. But I do think it is that healthy tension, right? That give and take, that interplay between, well, we've just learned something new, exactly like you said, that challenges one of these big assumptions we made. Now is the time to revisit, right? And I think that's also something you mentioned in the book, right? This interplay between revisiting something and actually changing it. Those are two different things.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, I think so often we have this idea that strategy is, a 3-year plan or a 5-year plan. I mean, first of all, it's probably not a plan anyway, but it's very much dependent on the maturity of your organization and your product. The earlier the product, the earlier the org, the shorter that time frame probably is. But whatever the time frame is, we should be checking in on it at least quarterly, right? If not more often. I think if you're in a startup, I actually love a 6-week cycle on some of these things, right? And that sounds onerous. So like, oh my God, we have to go do strategy again every 6 weeks. Well, you have to check in and make sure you're still heading in the right direction at least, right? Like double check those assumptions. Have we learned anything new? I think the most pernicious thing I've ever seen in organizations is when you're like, oh yeah, no, we know that assumption isn't right, but we don't have a strategy review till next year. So we're not going to, change that. And you're like, what are you guys even doing? Like, you're just going to wait a year and be heading in the wrong direction. So yeah, I think the timeliness thing is critical. And I absolutely do believe that it's a two-way street, right? I think it's so important that we empower our teams and that we listen to them when they come with new insight and new data, because again, they are the ones closest to the customer and closest to that. But at the end of the day, leadership has to provide that context, right? And I think that's the big distinction for me is it's not control, right? It's not micromanagement. It is context, right? Like we're heading this direction. These are our key customers. This is what we're focusing on. This is how we believe we're going to win. There's still a lot of freedom there for our teams to figure out, okay, what are the problems we're going to solve in that? How do we tackle this? How do we actually solve that? What's the best way to design the product? There's still a lot of empowerment to be done. It is just providing the context so everyone grows in the same direction. And that is where that tension comes from, right? Because only leadership can set the strategy and principles that are then used across the organization, just because they're the only ones seeing across the whole organization. But as we've talked about, like those individual contributors and teams are the ones talking to customers every day and learning those things and seeing those insights and seeing what's actually working. So it has to be a two-way street. It has to be a collaboration.
I want to come back to a couple of pieces that you said there because there's so much to pick out of what you've just said there, Martin. Back to kind of the timeliness of those strategy reviews. You said about 6 weeks or something. In that could even be quite a long time in some modern businesses. How quickly businesses are moving, how quickly businesses pivot, and it's not just I don't think about for the whole. At the top level, kind of review that strategy. Are we still going in the right direction? Are we still able to go after the right opportunities? But it's also about checking in across the business. Does the rest of the business still understand what that strategy is, the direction that we're going? Particularly at the pace that many businesses are running in, how distributed some businesses are in terms of either, where they are in the world or the different markets they operate in. Even if the strategy hasn't changed in that period of time, checking in and making sure that everybody is still aligned to that strategy is just as important.
Yeah, 100%. I think communicating it is an even more urgent layer, right? I think there's HBR research I quote in the book that says 95% of employees don't know what their company strategy is, right? And it sounds ridiculously high, but I think if we're honest with ourselves and go ask our colleagues, like it's probably pretty true as well, right? So I think that communication layer is almost the most critical one. so often organizations have some form of strategy, right? You can have a whole argument of whether it's good or not. It could always be better. But if your team doesn't even know what it is, like, it's not helping anyone. So that communication piece is absolutely critical. And I do think that's an even more sharp or tight cadence, right? I think it's something that we have to think about doing in every single all hands, every single update, every check-in, every team meeting, every planning session. And this again becomes one of the things that feels really onerous. It's like, oh, we have to go through like a 50-page. No. We're not talking about like going through every piece of, evidence you have behind it, the whole hypothesis, but reminding everyone again, what are those top level pieces, right? Like, as a reminder, this is our vision. I loved doing a pop quiz on this whenever I, ran teams, like just to get everyone remembering these things and just thinking about them every day, right? And the same with strategy, just like check in, like, as we know, this is what we're focused on. These are our 3 objectives for the quarter, right? Okay, cool. How's everyone doing this week, right? Like, it can be that quick, but it just means that we are keeping it front and center. And it's also an opportunity for everyone to go, oh yeah, wait a minute. But I just learned something that, challenges that. Like, maybe we should have that conversation in this session, right? So I think as leaders, it's the kind of thing where we think we already know it, and therefore we stop talking about it. But we forget that our team hasn't been in that conversation as much, or the people in the or the new joiner who just joined and hasn't seen it, right? Like, we forget that these communication channels have to be something that are consistent or repeated often, right? And we can learn from consumer marketing on this. Like, we know, you have to mention something 7 times, or you have to see an ad 7 times for it to land. It's the same in communications internally, right? I love this quote from Jeff Weiner, who's the CEO of LinkedIn, who says that once you're tired of saying it, people are starting to hear it, right? And so I think it's just one of these things we have to be much, much better at communicating, repeating, clarifying. And it also goes to different modes of learning, right? I think not everyone wants to read a long document, like a white paper or something like that. So there needs to be a slide version. Maybe there's I've even seen some people do cartoons, especially now with all the amazing AI tools that we have, right? Like, you can just create a little cartoon panel very quickly. You can create videos very quickly. So if you want to now create a vision video or a product vision video, you can do that so easily and cheaply, when that used to be a massive, agency job. So thinking about the different layers, like, the 1-sentence version, the paragraph version, all the supporting documentation somewhere in a wiki or a Notion, then thinking about, like, how do we add video or visuals or stories? How do we add, those customer layers? Like, oh, we have snippets from customer interviews and things like that. So it's a multi-layered, just something we have to repeat way more often than I think people do. It's not we went and had our offsite, here's the deck, all right, and then we're not going to see that again for 2 years until we do the next offsite, right? That's what doesn't work.
Which is what quite often what happens
Yes,
as well. And
sadly.
and there's, I think one thing that I was just listening to as you were saying that is we're talking about, fundamentally how a business is, building and maintaining a strategy and all the layers in between. And actually a critical part of this is actually just communication, And Antonio, I want to come to you a little bit because, from what you've heard there, how much of this suddenly falls on product ops' laps, especially when we're talking about the product strategy, to make sure that we are communicating well, that we are repeating that communication to the various different parts of, at least of our teams, if not the wider business.
Yeah, I feel like product ops here plays a huge role, but really I want to be very explicit in that it plays an enabling and an amplifying role. I don't think like product ops is not the person or the team that communicates this, right? This is product leadership, but it is absolutely within our best interests as well to make sure that, if we have an all hands format, front and center are those reminders, is that quick paragraph check-in of this is what's important to us, this is where we're going and how we're going to get there, right? That when teams are on the ground making daily decisions about what actually to build, they have these impulses that remind them, as a company, this is what we said was important. How does that translate in our day-to-day? So I think we have a really great opportunity in product ops to make sure those impulses and reminders are there. But I think ultimately, as with everything, we're really the facilitator, right? We're not there to create the strategy. We are there to make sure the strategy is heard. And I think we in product operations can take an awful lot of inspiration from the decision stack to really make sure at what level is what question useful or necessary, right? And how does it connect to the different parts, whether you go upwards or downwards.
And it goes both ways, right? I think it's not just the top-down element. It's, as we've been talking about, it's the bottom-up element as well, right? So product ops is definitely seeing some of those signals and probably seeing some of those patterns where like, oh, wait, we've now spoken to 2 or 3 teams who are facing the same decision or this challenge, right? Maybe we should elevate that or escalate that and have a bigger conversation. Like, do we need to clarify the strategy or principle, or is this a new thing that's challenged, right? So again, it goes both ways. It's just product ops are well suited to kind of flag those signals as well.
And Antonio, you mentioned something really key there about the ability to make decisions. As much I know this is a key part of the stack, and one of the reasons why the stack is actually really, really powerful is to empower at the various levels. And what I'm going to do actually for those watching, I'm going to flash up the image for the 5 stack layer, because it's really it does describe it very well. I kind of almost wish I had a background for it at the moment. But the 5 layers are really important in that decision-making process, about being able to empower those people and to a degree delegate decision-making as you go down through the layers to different people, or eventually to the ICs on the ground, the product managers and the product teams, to be able to make those decisions without having to escalate them all the way up through those, all the way up through the decision-making process, the levels of hierarchy within the business. Martin, I'd really love to hear, a little bit more about your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, one of the early talks I gave about this was at Mind the Product London, right? And that was really about decision-making fatigue as the lens to look at this from, right? I think as product teams, we're making hundreds of decisions a week about the product, but you have to put that in the context of the thousands of decisions we're making around ourselves as well. And so the more focus we as leaders can provide for those decisions, the easier some of those are, right? And that is all about strategy and principles, right? I think the many teams end up relitigating the same decision that, a partner team, 5 other teams in the organization have already been wrestling with. And that's just wasted time, right? And that's not something anyone in the organization wants. But it's also wasted energy, right? Everyone gets really tired thinking about all these things, going and doing the analysis again, having the argument again, when there might already be a really clear decision that like, no, we're focusing on this customer, not this customer. And so the more we can make those pieces clear that we've already had this, this big debate, we've looked at the data, we've looked at the assumptions, we've done the hypothesis testing, we have agreed as a business that this is our focus, you suddenly don't have to make that decision again, right? So that has 2 benefits. One, every single individual team just has, saved a lot of effort and a lot of stress from having to think about that decision. But 2, suddenly the whole organization is much more consistent, right? Because you're not making that decision at the team level hundreds of times over and potentially in different directions or different choices. And so it's really about both of those things. And again, it goes back to that context, not control piece, right? It's about creating clarity so that teams know within which boundaries they have the freedom to make decisions, and they don't have to escalate, to your point, all of these decisions up every single time, or just try to make a gut guess and end up going in different directions.
I have a question for you, Martin. Do you feel like the decision stack is better suited to the company layer or to the product layer?
I think it definitely started as a product tool, but it needs to be clear across the company. So I am trying to make this more of a company conversation. And inevitably, every time I get involved in companies now or in organizations, it ends up escalating to that level, right? They bring me in because they think they have an execution problem. They think they have a roadmap problem. They think they have a prioritization problem. And I'll sort of nod along and like, yep, okay, let's sign on the dotted line and start having the conversation. And then I start asking everyone in the exec team what their strategy is, right? And I start getting different answers back. And then that's the way to kind of start unlocking that for the rest of the org. And again, if that alignment's not there, it doesn't matter how amazing a job the product team is doing. If they're trying to do everything for everyone, if there is no clear answers, there's no clear trade-offs, there's no clear focus for the strategy, and you inevitably end up with that, do all the things as a strategy. And we all know that you can't do everything well. We never have enough resources, even with AI, to do everything. And so we're just not going to be successful. So yes, product can do it on its own. Like it's really useful for a product team to focus on their decision stack, have a clearer product strategy, and just execute on that basis. But it's even more powerful if the product leader can escalate that and make it a company-wide alignment tool as well.
Is the decision stack another framework? Is that another framework that teams need to learn and adopt and chuck something else out? Talk to me about that.
Well, I hope, again, it's more of a mental model than a framework. I hope it's not something that they feel like has to be a checkbox exercise. I hope it's really just a lens through which you can look at stuff that's already in your organization, right? I think most organizations have some form of this. Every organization has a decision stack, whether they call it that or not. It's just a question of how aligned those are and how well connected they are. And I think by using this, again, as a mental model or lens to really look at those, you can see, oh, yeah, no, we have a strategy. We just haven't communicated it very well. And then we haven't connected that very well to our OKRs. So let's do a better job of that. And then suddenly all of those pieces start working much better just because they're connected. And so then it's doing its job, right? It doesn't mean you have to rewrite the whole thing from scratch. Doesn't mean you have to start everything from the ground up. Doesn't mean you have to use OKRs, even, as I said, right? It's using whatever tools you already have in place. But the reality is most organizations, while they have a decision stack, it looks more like a haystack, right? It's just a mess of things. There's a strategy from like 5 years ago, a vision that's up on a wall that no one's looked at for a while. OKRs sitting in a spreadsheet somewhere, but not actually connected to the day-to-day work. And that's where these things break down, right? And that's where so many people get frustrated with OKRs because they're not connected to things. That's where people get tired of the strategy conversation because it's like, oh, well, that's just something leadership goes and does at a fancy offsite once a year, right? And it doesn't actually connect to my work. And so if we can start connecting these things, again, it's not about starting from scratch, but just getting better results out of the things we already have.
I said that obviously very tongue in cheek because I've firstly read the book and spoken to you about this, and it's a piece. I think it's on about page 3 or something like that you mention exactly that point.
We can call it a leading question, Graham.
That's the one. The point is I said right at the start, I've become very familiar with the decisions that in all but name, where I am at the moment, for a long time we've used vMost, which is so very similar, very similar visually. And, I see this in so many, I now looking back, seeing this in so many businesses that I've worked in as well. And I think that's the key is it's not changing how you're doing everything. All of the assets, all of those individual components, all those documents, all those strategy pieces, all of those videos and everything, and those PowerPoint presentations, they're all still valuable. They're all still valuable. It's actually just making sure that they are connected. And that's always the missing piece that I've always found. And I think that's what this describes here is just making sure that they are connected. Show how one does lag up. And there's another piece here as well, because you and I have had this conversation as well. And I had the same conversation with Matt LeMay talking about his book about the term cascading. How the layers cascade down or you ladder up from different layers. And the terminology itself, actually, I think is slightly misleading. It's not to say that they all have to, go up in that same direction, but it's that connective tissue. It's that connectivity is important to say, well, you've got a layer and that's either a decision layer or that's an information layer or that's a communication layer to make sure other people are aware and have a hand in things. That doesn't mean to say that every step of the way has to be a whole bureaucratic mess throughout it. And I think that's the reason why I think it's really clear to say that this is not just another framework. It's not a piece that you have to readopt, throw out OKRs and put this in place, throw out VMOs, put this in place, whatever. Actually, it's like you say, it's a lens, it's a thinking mechanism to say, how does what I'm doing now meaningfully impact and have value to this, to that, and further up the chain?
Yeah. I mean, as you can see, I'm a fan of Matt's book as well. So, and I love Christina Walke as well, who he quotes, right, with the kind of one step removed rule. And I think I actually quoted that in the book as well, right? I think it is incredibly important to remember that and utilize that in the decision stack as well. I think the biggest challenge with any of these things, right, is when you try to simplify a theoretical model and put it on a two-dimensional piece of paper, it will never fully reflect the n-dimensional kind of fractional reality or fractal reality that we live in, right? So you always have to take that with a grain of salt and use that simplicity as a feature, not a bug. But I do think that one step removed rule is critical. And I do see early kind of users of this kind of end up in that fractal world where like, oh, well, we have a decision stack for the organization. Then we have one for each business unit. Then we have one for each product team. Then we have one, and that just ladders up. Suddenly you have 5 vision. Like that doesn't make sense, right? Obviously. And so it's really thinking about where do you break the stack that it makes sense. And again, the question has become really powerful there because it's really about thinking about where do the answers to those questions start diverging. That's the only place where you want to break it, right? So hopefully most of the organization, the answer to where are we going is the same. So your vision should be the same for the whole organization. And then the next step, how will we get there? Well, if it's like is your strategy. You probably have that pretty much shared across the organization, but maybe you have 2 different business units. Maybe you have different products, right? So the question might be different, in which case you will have different strategies. So that makes sense again. But again, this is just thinking about it as like a diagnostic tool or lens to look at what's already in your organization rather than just slapping on another framework.
Yeah, it's very interesting listening to you speak about this. I feel like there are a lot of parallels between how people handle product operations, not as a function, but as a capability within their teams. And I think it's the same when you don't really have a product ops strategy. Like, this work is still happening. People are still doing it. They are doing it disjointed. You may have artifacts here and there. Different people have different opinions about what's important, but doing it with one strategy, with one lens of this is the future we are working towards and this is how we are enabling that future. I think it's about intention, right? And I think it's very similar with having a strategy that you actually live in teams. Most teams have something like a vision, something like a strategy, something like measurable goals, right? But it's the how intentional you are about bringing all of those things together and remembering and using them in your everyday to actually make those decisions. That's what's really making the difference.
But that's key, isn't it? Is making sure that so those conversations are constantly happening. Comes back to what you said earlier, and the point that you made very well earlier, Antonio, is that product ops is not there to write the communications. It's not there to evangelize the strategy. The product ops is there to make sure that these things are happening, not necessarily to do them. And it's the same thing here. It's making sure that actually in your strategy meetings, in your sprint retros, in all of these different conversations, are we remembering the right reasons? Are we remembering the right things of why we've got this strategy? What's the things that we are aiming for? What value are we bringing to all of this? Because again, if that's not happening, then people forget, or people get lazy, or we go off in a direction because assumptions are made. And so just making sure that these things are repeating, as I think Martin, you said, repeat it 7 times and suddenly starts to go in. That's the important part here that product ops can make sure is just constantly happening.
Yeah, and I think it's even thinking about tooling as we go forward, right? Like, how are we thinking about connecting these things? How are we making sure that OKRs don't sit in a spreadsheet and then don't get looked at for the rest of the quarter, right? Like, all of these things are in product ops remit, right? Of like, how do we make sure, we're actually using these things? How do we make sure we're actually looking at our metrics every sprint, every quarter, more than every quarter, to make sure we are on the right track, but also that the decisions we're making are connecting back to those things that we have agreed are important, right? As Antonio said. So I think it's both ways, and product ops has a central role in this.
There's a piece that we've touched upon earlier today a couple of times, but that falls outside of the stack a little bit. And you drill down into this towards the end of the book, which is principles. Talk to me about principles. Talk to us about principles a little bit more.
Yeah, I do think it's one of the bigger unlocks for people as well, right? I think you talked about vMost, right? And I think vMost is a great tool, but it doesn't really get to this level. And I think principles, like, you don't have to use a stack to use principles, but I think it's one of those things that really changes how people make decisions in our organization. So I learned this lesson fairly early on, right? 99, I joined Monster as a product manager and realized that's what I wanted to do with the rest of my career.
Well, let's go.
But also,
I have been Monster.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Job board, for those who don't remember, right? So two-sided marketplace, job seekers on the one side, recruiters on the other. And when I joined, we would have that debate basically every single time we're looking at a new initiative. We're like, oh, well, do we do this in the job seeker friendly way, or do we do it in the recruiter friendly way? And like, we'd go back and forth and we'd do some analysis and we'd write a massive document. This is also back in the day when we wrote actual PRDs for like 6 months, threw them over the wall to engineering and hope we got something out the other end. But that's a conversation for another time. Until a few months in, I was in the headquarters just outside Boston having the same debate in a meeting room. And I see the CEO and founder walk by and I like pull him into the room, the joys of working in a smaller or scale up at the time, at least. And I ask him, like, please help us resolve this question. And he listened for a few minutes and he went, hang on, job seekers always come first, because if we make a great experience for them, then the recruiters have to follow. And that was part of the strategy. It just wasn't something that had been articulated to us, and it hadn't been articulated in that trade-off way, right? And so that became what we later called a principle. And suddenly you can imagine those debates just go away, right? You don't ever have to have that debate again because we've already had it once. We've done the hypothesis testing. We've figured out why. We've made the bet. We've made the decision. And suddenly every single time that becomes a trade-off, you know that the job seeker comes first. And there's great examples of this, right? So it's especially easy to bring up two-sided marketplaces, but Shopify is another example where they took the flip side and they said merchants come first because they believe by building the best possible experience for merchants, they'll get lots of interesting shops and e-commerce experiences, and then the customers will follow, right? But it's making that bet that like, this is what we're focused on. This is what's core to our business. This is what's really going to make us successful. And again, it's a re-articulation of your strategy, but in a way that really helps decision-making at the edges of your organization, right? So at the individual team layer, at the individual contributor layer, you're facing this like, oh, I could do it this way, I could do, oh, right, job seeker first, done, right? You don't have to have the debate. You don't have to escalate it. You don't have to like wait for, you know what that clarity is.
I love that. I talk about something very similar when I coach product ops leaders, and it's this idea of eking out this kind of, what do we want to be known for? That's how I tend to frame it in a product ops way. Like, if we are absolutely optimizing for being customer obsessed, that will dramatically change what we will enable our teams to do. If we are optimizing for engineering excellence and, the most stable, secure infrastructure possible, that will be, at the end of the day, a different organization than the one that bets on being customer obsessed, even though you may have the same strategy to begin with, right? Yeah. And I think it's that it really is just something that unlocks your next step, right? If you have two things that are more or less equal in terms of return, what do you actually focus on at the end of the day? And I love that.
And it doesn't, so one of the favorite tools I like for that is the even over statement, right? So you know these from the Agile Manifesto, yes. Right? And it just like the Agile Manifesto, we're not saying recruiters aren't important. We're just saying in any trade-off scenario, the job seeker comes first, right? And I think where this gets really interesting is you look at Monster again, and of course we had whole teams that just built recruiter tools. And it didn't mean they had their own principles. They still had that same principle of job seekers even over recruiters, so that in any trade-off that they faced, they would still go, okay, I know I'm building a recruiter tool. I'm building the way they publish their job posts or the way they search the database or whatever. But that still doesn't mean I can, make this a anti-job seeker or like, be exploitative of the job seeker or things like that. I still have to put the job seeker first. So those principles really are critical across your whole team and make your strategy so much more actionable.
Do you feel that businesses or most businesses have those principles somewhere already? Whether they're written down or not is a different matter, but do you feel that they already kind of have those? There's sort of a feeling of what those principles are, those even overs, or do you feel that actually businesses may need to kind of sit down and think about these a little bit more? And actually that kind of is a question for both of you, because I'm sure you've both got different answers to this.
I find most organizations don't have them. They might sit in a CEO's head or something like that and like be quite easy to draw out. But they're definitely not communicated. They're definitely not written down. They're definitely not used. And that goes for good strategy as well, right? I mean, this comes from those strategic trade-offs, right? Of like focusing and making a choice, like we are a job seeker even over recruiter, or we are focused on, we're going for the UK, not France, or whatever the kind of trade-off that you're trying to make to give focus for the rest of your organization. They tend not to be well articulated if they've been made at all. And so it's really about drawing that out of your leadership and codifying it and clarifying it. And sometimes that means challenging them, right? And bringing that straw man almost of like, I think we need to focus on the UK. Here's why. Again, we are the ones closest to the data, closest to the customer. We should have a pretty good hypothesis on this. And then presenting that up, again, evidence, not opinion, bringing those hypotheses, bringing the assumptions, bringing the data behind that, and kind of presenting it up to the team and seeing what leadership says. But I think we do need to be a lot better at articulating those. And I think as ICs, we can challenge that. As product leaders, we should be challenging the rest of our organization to do that. I think especially product leaders tend to forget that your job is not just the product team, right? Your job is the whole company. And so it is incumbent on you to be part of that leadership group to challenge that and ask for those clarity and ask for that strategic focus, right?
Yeah. I think I actually have quite a similar answer. I So with organizational design, the interesting thing is that depending on your exec team and your leadership team, different people may have very different opinions on what is most important, right? You tend to see this sometimes with incredibly strong, passionate CTOs who they are shooting for engineering excellence all day, every day, at the cost of maybe innovation, maybe, running a little bit faster, whatever it might be. But I think the tension there is that you need to agree broadly, right? And everybody needs to agree that that is a direction that is defensible for the company, that makes sense for the company, and that they can stand behind, even though it might sound like it is to their discipline's detriment almost. Like it's a little bit similar to what you just mentioned, Martin, right? You had still recruiter teams working on recruiter tools or recruiter products and features. That doesn't mean they weren't important. And I think it's very similar to this. If you are saying we are an organization that puts, like I said, engineering excellence front and center, that doesn't mean product takes a back seat. That means we are optimizing for a specific thing. We're doing that together, but we are optimizing for this one thing that we have chosen.
And I think that's really important, isn't it? Is because I could quite easily see in many businesses that a particular principle would underwhelm or sorry, undermine certain teams. If you're on part of a product, if you're on the recruiter side of the business, it would be quite easy for you to go, well, we're not important here. Why are we pushing everything forward? Why are we putting any resources to this at all? And it's not saying that at all. It's just when it comes to trade-off decision, that is the decision. And it's not there to say as well that that's always going to be the decision that's being made. It's a principle. This is what would typically happen. If you need to make a decision, and I don't know, and I know we're not saying this, but you haven't got a leader to go and ask this question of, well, okay, well then that's the almost the default position. But it doesn't mean to say that it's never going to change. It doesn't mean to say it's never going to pivot. It doesn't mean to say that actually you're not going to run a particular project where actually you're going to put a huge amount of resource on X, Y, and Z. And I think that's a key important piece to mention.
Yeah, this could even be another reason why having visibility to the whole stack across the org is actually so important, right? Because I think if you saw the whole stack at Monster, retrofitting this a little bit, you would see, obviously, the recruiter teams have massive parts of the strategy. They have they're massively responsible for huge parts of the objectives, and they have OKRs, and they have opportunities around that. So like they are a massive part of the team. They are, more responsible for the bottom line than the job seeker side of the business, et cetera, et cetera. So you can see a lot more that like they are visible, they are important, that product is incredibly important, but we still have this principle of how we make those choices and how we choose between opportunities is that we're always going to choose the one that doesn't, piss off job seekers or exploit that, because if we lose the job seekers, then it doesn't matter how good the recruiter product is, right? So I think that's where having the visibility of the whole piece, not just, even the principles on the wall or even just having the vision, like it's not enough. You need to see the whole piece to know that, oh yeah, my work actually does really matter. We just have these guardrails or these principles in place to make sure that we do it in a way that aligns with what we're trying to do as a whole organization.
And so then the final piece to follow up with that then is, can and or should those principles be challenged?
Absolutely. I think every level of the stack should be open to challenge, right? Obviously, this comes with a massive caveat around psychological safety and assuming that we have some level of psychological safety in our organizations. But that to me is kind of foundational to empowering teams in the first place. So hopefully we're moving in that direction anyway. I do want to acknowledge that not every organization has that, and it's not, everyone listening is not going to be able to do this. But in a good, healthy organization, you should be able to challenge any level of the stack in the right way, right? So this is not about going to leadership and saying, hey, you're an idiot because our strategy isn't there. There are better ways to answer that question or ask that question. There's better ways to kind of bring that up. Again, I think a straw man is often a great way to do it, of like, oh, I think this is what our strategy is based on X, Y, Z. Like, does that make sense? Have I missed something? Having an open conversation like that. I do think, though, at any point, whether it's principles or strategy or even, OKRs, if we have at any point learned something new, even in just a customer discovery call that we've had, we should be able to put our hand up and go, whoa, hang on a minute. This was just fundamentally like challenge this core assumption that we had. We need to go back to the drawing board, make sure this is still the right thing. Obviously, one conversation might be. N of 1 is not necessarily statistically significant and all that, but at least it's that signal, right? And so I think at any point we need to build that psychological safety so our team can challenge us on these things. And again, that's where this two-way conversation starts from, right? And again, why it's possibly so important that product ops gets involved in this and creates and makes sure that those two-way communication channels exist so that new information can bubble up as much as it comes down from leadership, right?
Antonio, any final words from yourself on that point?
Goodness, not on that point specifically. I think that I really like the framing of the decision stack as a mental model, because I really think that's very true to what it is and what it's trying to do. And I'm really looking forward to teams having more defined language for the entire interplay, right, between the very highest level and the very lowest level. And I think it's going to be incredibly powerful. I'm glad it's out. I've seen it, be out and about for a while now. It's exciting to see it laid down so quote unquote obviously, but also so in such a useful way that we can really make use of it. And I think definitely for product operations, anybody who's not familiar with it, try putting your company's context within that frame, because I think it will quickly show you where the gaps are and where the quickest wins for you as a product ops person might actually be.
Yeah, I think there's a key piece there for product ops that actually can be taken up today. Anybody that's watching this now, you can take this up today and to do just a bit of a diagnosis. You can do this yourself, and see how much of your business strategy that you actually understand and putting it into the decision stack, and pass it across to some of your colleagues as well and run those experiments and see actually how well everything is understood or not. And it's not a right or wrong answer. It's a case of, okay, well, actually, this is now the starting point. Like so much that we do within product operations that we, particularly when we're either starting out or we're working on a new area or a new project, let's just go and find out what everybody thinks at the moment. Let's go and find out what people know right now. What is the lay of the land? And from that, will tell you either how far you've got to go or actually what direction you need to be going, what resources you need to help communicate the strategy a little bit better or wider and whatnot. Martin, thank you very much so much for joining us today. I've got my copy here. I don't know if the screen's going to show that well, but we're going to put some links to your site and the book and everything else. The book is just absolutely fantastic. So I really do recommend anybody that's watching this, whether you're in product operations or you're a product leader, do please go and check the book out, because I think you'll find it incredibly invaluable. Martin, so firstly, thank you so much for joining us today and for sharing everything you shared.
Thanks for having me, and thanks for the feedback along the way as well, Graham.
You're very welcome. Once again, I'd like to thank our special guest today, Martin, for everything we've talked about. Do connect with any of us on LinkedIn. Do also please go and at least look at, if not purchase, the book. We'll put a little link to the site about here. Thank you to everybody watching today. We are out of time. Antonio and I look forward to welcoming you on the next episode of the Product Opscast. Thank you, everybody.